won't want to miss. Many will be relieved to hear that Darius, Nunu, and Olaf have all finally been targeted for nerfs, while some struggling picks like Mundo, Varus, and LeBlanc have been buffed. Like always, we put together the tier list with the help of our challenger players and have crunched the numbers on the most recent analytics to give you guys the best tier list possible. Before we get into it, let us know down in the comments who you guys chose in the champion rework vote. Personally, I went with Udyr since his whole kit and visuals are just so outdated, but honestly, any of the 5 champs would have been a great pick. We're also super excited to let you guys know we've started a brand new channel to keep all of you completely up to date with the best new builds and picks for each patch. You're not going to want to miss out, so use the link in the description to head on over and drop a sub. Alright, and with all that out of the way, let's jump into it. First off, if we take a look at the item and rune nerfs, Ravenous Hunter's Omnivamp has been reduced from 2 down to 1.7% per stack. Ravenous Hunter has really overshadowed the other options in that row of domination runes for a while. With this nerf, runes like Ultimate Hunter and Relentless Hunter should become more viable on certain champs. For the second patch in a row, Rocket Belt has been nerfed, and this time it's a straight up nerf. The move speed boost has been lowered from 50% for 2 seconds down to 30% for 1.5 seconds. This will slightly hurt champions like Fizz and Echo, whose engage capabilities when activating that speed boost from Rocket Belt is so much stronger. Riot's pulling a complete 180 on the Gale Force cooldown buff they issued a few patches back. The buff has been reverted, going from 60 seconds back up to 90. This will bring the item back in line with Shield Bow and Kraken Slayer, as Gale Force just really started to outperform those other two in the previous patches. On champions like Jhin and Miss Fortune, who really thrived with Gale Force, you'll still likely purchase the item every game, but choosing the correct time to use the active will be much more important now. Imperial Mandate has received a nerf, as the per target cooldown on the passive will now apply on initial application of CC instead of when an ally procs it. Champions who perform well with both Mandate and Moonstone will now swap over to prioritizing Moonstone for most games. Seraphine, for example, already wins more with Moonstone before this nerf to Mandate, meaning the change should tilt the tables towards Moonstone even further. If you're really getting a little tired of Katarina one-shotting you with true damage from Kraken Slayer, then you'll be relieved a bit by this next change. The damage proc from Kraken Slayer will now respect reduced on-hit modifiers. This will nerf champs like Cat and Aphelios slightly, however it shouldn't remove them from the meta, especially for Cat. She can do well even without Kraken Slayer, going for a full AP build, so the change unfortunately won't really impact the champion's strength. Moving on to some item buffs now. First, we have Turbo Chem Tank. The cost of the item has been reduced from 3,200 to 2,800. The build path is also a lot more friendly now, as the MR component will now consist of a Null Magic Mantle instead of a Negatron Cloak. The ability haste has been increased from 15 up to 20. Magic resist has been lowered from 50 to 25. This is an interesting change here, as this means Chem Tank will no longer have value in the extra magic resist it provided. Finally, the Mythic passive has been changed from 5% tenacity to 5% ability haste. All in all, this change now puts Chem Tank more in line with Sunfire Aegis in terms of the resists it provides, and the reason you purchase the item will no longer be due to the extra MR, but instead for the active move speed buff. Frostfire Gauntlet is receiving a very similar set of changes that Chem Tank saw. The cost is lowered from 3,200 to 2,800. The build path now features a cloth armor instead of a chain vest. Ability haste is increased from 15 to 20, and the armor decreased from 50 to 25. With both these changes, Riot's goal is to make these items more appealing as a cheaper tank option than Sunfire. Sunfire will still cost 3,200 gold, so by purchasing Frostfire or Chem Tank, you'll be able to obtain that Immolate passive a little quicker. Tanks like Cho'Gath and Volibear, who have already been performing extremely well with Frostfire in the previous patches, will see a boost to their early game spike for 11.2. Next up is a rather odd change, as Stoneplate is actually being buffed. The item already performs really nicely as a third pickup on a lot of these tanks, but doesn't have the highest play rate, which is why Riot may be buffing it so more people pick it up. The Fortify passive, granting you bonus resists when you take damage, has been buffed from 3% bonus resists, max 15%, up to 5% bonus resists, maxed out at 25%. This will make champs like Nasus and Cho'Gath even beefier in the late game and more difficult to beat down. The final item buff for this patch went the way of Essence Reaver. Instead of restoring 3% max mana on proc, the passive will scale off of AD. You will now restore mana based on 40% of your base AD, along with 16% bonus AD. This is a massive buff to champs like Lucian, Xayah, and Sivir. To emphasize this, we did the math on the difference in mana restore from last patch to now. Last patch, a level 11 Lucian with Gale Force and Essence Reaver would be getting 22 mana back per proc. This patch, it's now more than doubled at 55 mana back per proc. This will really help out all these Essence Reaver champs and give them a much smoother mid-game spike. For a couple of other item adjustments we need to cover, Sunfire Aegis has had its ability haste from the passive removed and exchanged for 5% tenacity. This basically ends up being a swap of passives between Chemtank and Sunfire. Both Phantom Dancer and Hurricane sees their cost increase from 2500 to 2600, but the attack speed goes up as well from 40% to 45%. Umbral Glaive has its cost reduced from 2800 to 2600, but its AD lowered too, from 55 to 50. This will help out supports like Pyke and Senna reach their item spikes a little sooner. Serpent's Fang sees an almost identical change as the cost is reduced from 2800 to 2600 and the AD down from 60 to 55. Chempunk Chainsword's cost is lowered from 2700 to 2600 and the health reduced from 200 to 150. And then for the final item change, Shralia's Battle Song is receiving a mini rework. Health has been reduced from 350 to 200, the move speed has been removed, the item will now grant 40 AP, and the base mana regen has been increased from 50% up to 100%. Shralia's should now have a little more chance of competing with Mandate and Moonstone on these Enchanter supports. Moving on to the top lane changes now, Darius has been basking in the glory for far too long, so his early game is getting hit with a nerf. His passive Noxian Might's bonus AD has been lowered from 30 scaling to 230, down to 20 scaling to 205. Keep in mind that this Noxian Might effect only activates when Darius gets 5 stacks of his passive or a takedown with his ult. The nerf doesn't affect the bleed damage leading up to those 5 stacks at all, so the nerf isn't as bad as it may seem. The Dunk Master will see a slight drop in power for 11.2, but our analysts don't believe it will be quite enough to remove him from OP tier just yet. Aatrox will be receiving an adjustment to the healing in his kit. His E will now grant 25 scaling to 45% healing during his ultimate. And then his ultimate healing amp has been reduced from 50 scaling to 100% down to 30 scaling to 60%. Even though Riot has labeled this change as an adjustment, it actually ends up being more of a nerf. When you ult, you'll be getting the 25% healing from E, which is actually only 5% more than what you get when your ult isn't activated at 20%. The 5% E buff just really doesn't compensate at all for the amount of healing you will be losing from your ultimate, which sees a 20% decrease at rank 1 in it. All in all, Aatrox's power level will drop a little for 11.2. We don't think the change is enough to drop him all the way down to B tier, so he will remain in A tier for now. The OP tier for 11.2 will stay consistent with how it looked last patch. Pantheon, Darius, Camille, and Malphite will remain your top 4 picks to climb with in solo queue. Watch out for tank picks like Cho'Gath and Sion for 11.2. The changes to Frostfire Gauntlet along with Stoneflate give these champs a nice little boost. Both will be really solid pickups in our S tier. The low elo picks of the patch include Malphite, Garen, and Nasus. Garen has indirectly become much stronger due to the Stride Breaker bug fix from last patch, and Nasus has been performing extremely well in the lower ranks ever since his Q buff in 10.25. And for the best top lane bans in 11.2, our analysts recommend Darius, Malphite, and Camille. All champs are picked at an absurd rate right now and are super OP in the meta, so you'll get good use out of banning one of them. Let's take a look into the jungle now, as we have 3 nerfs and 4 buffs, so jungle is loaded for this patch. First, we got a small nerf to Elise's Spider Q damage. It's nerfed from 70 scaling to 230 down to 70 scaling to 210. This really won't hurt Elise at a meaningful level, especially considering the damage at rank 1 wasn't nerfed at all. This means her level 3 skirmish will still remain as strong as it is, and since she's an early game reliant jungler anyways, taking 20 damage off later in the game won't be the reason this champ falls out of meta. For that reason, Elise will remain in the S tier as one of the best junglers for 11.2. The second jungle nerf is headed the way of Olaf, as his W lifesteal has been increased from 14 scaling to 22 up to 16 scaling to 24%. However, the healing amp is being nerfed. It will now sit at 0 scaling to 33% based on missing health instead of the 0 scaling to 50% in previous patches. This change is definitely more impactful than the one to Elise because it actually hurts Olaf's early game skirmish. The bearded barbarian will drop in power slightly, but our analysts don't believe it will be enough to push him down into A tier. The final jungle nerf has been handed out to Nunu. This movement speed is lowered from 345 down to 340, and base HP going from 580 to 540. Base stat nerfs always seems to be scoffed at by most of the player base, but they're a lot more impactful than people think. Last season, for example, Karth has completely disappeared from the meta after a 10 base move speed nerf. Especially for a jungler, that move speed is so important early on to get around the map for ganks and to clear your jungle faster. 5 move speed isn't the end of the world, but when you tag on the 40 base HP nerf too, Nunu will be dropping out of OP tier for the first time in the past few months. A jungler who quite frankly has had a very difficult time going where he pleases has been Mundo. Just last patch, Grievous Wound's duration was increased from 2 to 3 seconds, which is such a big nerf to Mundo. To try to bring him up in power a little, Riot will be buffing him in a few different ways. His Q refund on hit has been increased from 40 up to 50%. The refund on kill has gone from 80 to 100%. E mana cost is down by 5 at all ranks. E damage has gone from 3 scaling to 5 up to 4 scaling to 6 max HP. And his R healing has been buffed from 50 scaling to 100 up to 50 scaling to 110% max HP. To be completely fair, these buffs won't do anything for Mundo. The healing buffs are pretty much negligible considering how much healing reduction is in the game. If anything, the change to his E might make him a more worthwhile pick in counter situations against other tanks, but by no means will these changes turn him into a meta pick. He will be placed down in our B tier for 11.2. The Troll King has been stuck under his bridge for a few months now, so Trundle has received a few buffs. Q bonus damage sees an increase from 10 scaling to 50 up to 15 scaling to 55 total AD. On top of that, Trundle's W attack speed is buffed from 20 scaling to 100 up to 30 scaling to 110%. These changes will give him a decent boost at all stages of the game. Similar to Mundo though, he likely will remain nothing more than a niche counter and an average solo Q pick at best. Trundle will join Mundo down in the B tier. With the Tiamat changes in Season 11, Shaco has been struggling to find a place in the meta. To try and alleviate this, Riot has buffed Shaco's passive backstab damage from 10 scaling to 25 up to 20 scaling to 35. Although quite small, any sort of early game damage buff will be welcomed by Shaco players. The change isn't going to push him over the top, but it will be enough to book him a seat in our A tier for 11.2. Nocturne currently holds one of the lowest win rates for any jungler to start off the season at around 45%. To help him out a little, Riot has buffed his Q cooldown from 10 down to 8 seconds at all ranks. His ultimate cooldown has been reduced as well by 10 seconds at all ranks. If Nocturne wasn't one of the worst junglers in the game, a change like this could actually turn him into a meta pick. Since both his win rate and play rate are abysmal right now, it just indicates how weak this champ is, and even with this change, it will only be enough for us to slot him into B tier. So with all those jungle changes covered now, let's have a look at how the jungle tier list shapes out. With Nunu dropping out of the OP tier, Ivern will be taking his place alongside Kha'Zix and Hecarim. Another patch and another 2 weeks of Kha'Zix and Hecarim stealing everyone's elo. With all these other junglers being nerfed recently, like Nunu, Olaf, Fiddle, and Elise, it just indirectly makes Kha'Zix and Hecarim even stronger. As for Ivern, he's been a super strong pick ever since his buffs a couple patches back. He currently holds one of the highest win rates for any champ in the game at around 54%, which is almost unheard of. Other than Ivern and Nunu swapping places, Shaco moving up a tier, and a few small adjustments to a few other picks, the jungle meta won't see any major shifts for 11.2. Our top 3 low elo jungle picks of the patch are Fiddle, Rammus, and Warwick. Fiddle's strength rises even higher in the lower ranks due to people disrespecting his ult plays. Rammus's ganks are so strong and super easy to execute, and Warwick's kit just has everything you'd want for a great low elo champ. And the best bans for 11.1 will remain the exact same picks we had last patch with Kha'Zix, Nunu, and Hecarim. Just a couple direct changes to mid lane in 11.2. Let's start off by looking at LeBlanc. Her health per level has increased from 92 up to 97, and her Q mana cost lowered from 50 scaling to 90 down to 50 scaling to 70. These buffs are more of a nudge to let people know LeBlanc exists than a buff that will actually increase her power level. The extra 5 HP per level will make her early game ever so slightly stronger, but the mana buff doesn't do as much since the cost wasn't lowered at all at rank 1 in it. As a result of these changes, LeBlanc won't be moving up on our tier list and will remain in the A tier. Is it really a league patch if Akali isn't being hit with some sort of nerf? The energy cost on her Q is being increased from 120 scaling to 80 up to 120 scaling to 100. This is actually a revert to a buff she got back in 10.23. The change will now put Akali in the territory to where she's just not worth picking over other mids. We'll be placing her in our B tier as she can still be a really strong pick in the higher elos, but if you're in the lower ranks, we would definitely recommend staying away from her. Azir mains would have been really happy to see their champ on the buff list, but probably went back to cry in a corner after they saw what the change was. Azir's cooldown has been decreased by a whole 1 second at all ranks. That's it. That's the buff. We feel like Riot could have been a little less conservative in buffing Azir since he holds a measly 46% win rate in solo queue, but pro play just always seems to screw this champ over. If Riot were to buff him too much, he'd become a picker ban in pro, so Azir mains will almost always have to accept the fact their champ will be weak for solo queue. Azir will remain in our C tier for yet another patch. Now for the mid lane tier list, we have Galio, Anivia, Fizz, and Pantheon as the 4 OP picks. Echo will be moving down into S tier and still remain one of the best mid picks, but due to the Rocket Belt nerfs and picks like Kassadin and Galio on the rise, his power level has been suffering slightly as of recent. Kassadin will be moving up into our S tier due to his continued success after the Everfrost buffs. The best low elo picks for mid lane won't change at all from last patch, as we have Anivia, Malz, and Annie. And the mid laners most worth spending your ban on are Fizz, Zed, and Anivia. Caitlyn and Varus are the only two ADCs who have been changed this patch, and they both received buffs. First, if we take a look at Kate, her AD per level goes up from 2.88 to 3.3. If our match checks out, that's a 0.42 AD increase, meaning Kate would have about an extra 7 AD at level 18. Nothing too crazy at all, but a buff nonetheless to a struggling Kate. She's been hovering around B and A tier over the past couple patches now, so with this change, we will drop her into the A tier. And then, as for Varus, his changes are actually pretty impactful. Mana per level has been increased from 33 up to 40, and then his ultimate cooldown, which is the big one here, has been reduced from 120 at rank 1 down to 100 seconds. This is huge for Varus, as the cooldown is now actually lower than it was back when he was considered an OP pick. This will just give him so much more playmaking potential, and with the support meta consisting of picks like Leona, Thresh, and Maokai, he can synergize and fit in quite nicely. These changes will allow Varus to make his way out of B and into A tier for 11.2. Breaking down the complete ADC tier list, Jhin and Kai'Sa are just so insanely strong at the moment and a cut above all else, so they will make up our OP tier along with Swain. Seriously guys, if you're looking for some freelo, don't sleep on Swain. He's super easy to play, synergizes insanely well with meta supports, and scales like a monster. As for the rest of the tier list, it's really logjammed right now in the A tier. With recent buffs to Hurricane and then Essence Reaver here in this patch, it's made a bunch of picks good, but really nothing more than that. We don't believe the Essence Reaver buffs will be enough to propel Sivir, Lucian, or Xayah up the tier list, but we will keep a close eye on them throughout the patch and make adjustments if needed for 11.3. The best low elo picks for ADC include Miss Fortune, Swain, and Tristana, and the best bans remain Kai'Sa, Vayne, and Jhin. Looking at the support role, Maokai is the lone support nerf for 11.2. Maokai's E mana cost is increased from 60 scaling to 80 up to 60 scaling to 100. On top of that, his E damage AP ratio has been nerfed from 1% per 100 AP down to 0.8% per 100 AP. Maokai's been arguably the strongest support over the past couple of patches now, and we don't see that changing just yet. He will definitely take a hit with these nerfs, but our analysts believe he will continue to hold onto OP tier by a thread. Senna's been on quite the power level roller coaster. She was once one of the best supports in the game, but as of recent has dropped to one of the worst. Her attack speed ratio has been buffed from 0.2 up to 0.3. Non-kill ghoul spawn chance has been increased from 22 up to 28%. Gold from ghouls has been more than doubled, going from 3 to 8. And then lastly, her Q healing ratio are buffed. The AD ratio from 40 up to 50%, and the AP ratio from 25 to 40. These buffs, along with the Umbral Glaive changes we touched on earlier, will be enough to move Senna up in a viable spot, but she'll still remain one of the weaker picks in the B tier. Soraka has had a pretty miserable start to the season as well, only achieving about a 46% win rate. To try and help her out a little, Riot is buffing her Q health restore from 50 scaling to 90 up to 50 scaling to 110. Her W health restore has been buffed by 10 at all ranks, and the AP ratio from 60 up to 70%. The Banana Lady has seen her better days, and even with these changes, she will still remain an average pick down in B tier. So, for the support tier list, we have a few notable adjustments from last patch. Like we mentioned in our previous tier video, Seraphine has been on the edge of OP tier. This patch, she'll make that final jump and solidify herself a spot in OP. She will take Janna's place as we will be dropping her down to S. The rest of the OP tier will include Leona, Lulu, and Maokai. Watch out for Rell. Her win rate just continues to rise as more and more people figure out how to play her optimally, and it doesn't show signs of stopping. For now, we are placing her in the S tier as one of the best support picks, but don't be surprised to see her make the jump to OP for 11.3. A few of the best low elo picks to highlight are Maokai, Swain, and Brand. And we won't be changing anything around with the best bans, as Leona, Lulu, and Morgana are still your best options. So, there you have it, guys. That's everything you need to know for 11.